Welcome, dear friend. I know you watch this video to fall asleep, so before that, like, comment, and share this video. Also, where are you from and what time is it where you are from? Tonight, as darkness settles around you and the day's burdens begin to fade, you are about to embark upon a journey unlike any other. Not through distant lands or forgotten realms, but into the profound depths of ancient wisdom that has guided seekers toward peace for over 2.5 millennia. These are not merely stories to be heard, but sacred teachings woven into narrative form, each one a doorway to deeper understanding and lasting tranquility. For centuries, Buddhist masters have shared these tales in quiet monasteries, humble village squares, and beneath starlit skies, knowing that wisdom often travels best through the gentle vehicle of story. Tonight, you will discover 400 such treasures, each one carefully selected to quiet your restless mind and guide your spirit toward the profound peace that exists within your very being. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen as you settle into this sacred space we are creating together. Release the tensions of your day, the worries that cling to your consciousness like morning mist. For the next several hours, you need not carry the weight of tomorrow's concerns or yesterday's regrets. Here, in this moment, exists only the timeless wisdom of those who have walked the path before us, leaving behind these luminous stories like stepping stones across the river of human experience. The Buddha himself understood that truth often reveals itself most clearly through parable and narrative. When direct teaching might overwhelm the mind, a simple story can slip past our defenses and plant seeds of understanding in the fertile soil of our sleeping consciousness. Tonight, these ancient tales will work their gentle magic as your awareness transitions from the busy chatter of daily life into the receptive stillness of deep rest. Each story you are about to hear has been polished smooth by countless generations of telling, like river stones worn perfect by flowing water. Some emerged from the lips of the Buddha himself, others from his devoted disciples who carried these teachings across vast continents and through tumultuous centuries. All have been preserved because they contain something essential, something that speaks to the deepest questions of human existence. Our first story takes us to a time when the world was younger, when ancient forests stretched unbroken across the earth, and wisdom was passed from teacher to student in the gentle rhythm of daily life. It is the tale of the merchant and the singing bowl, a story that reveals how the most precious treasures are often hidden in the most humble appearances. Long ago, in a bustling marketplace at the crossroads of 3 great kingdoms, there lived a merchant named Ananda who dealt in fine goods from across the known world. His stall overflowed with silks from distant lands, spices that carried the essence of far-off gardens, and vessels crafted by the most skilled artisans of his time. People travelled great distances to browse his wares, knowing that Ananda possessed an eye for beauty and quality that few could match. One morning, as the first light of dawn painted the marketplace in shades of gold and amber, an elderly woman approached his stall carrying nothing but a simple cloth bundle. Her clothes were worn but clean, her face lined with the stories of many years, and her eyes held a depth that seemed to reflect both great sorrow and profound peace. She unwrapped her bundle to reveal a small bronze bowl, tarnished with age, and bearing no decorative elements that might catch a merchant's eye. The bowl appeared utterly ordinary, the kind of simple vessel that might grace any humble household for holding rice or water. Yet something about the way the old woman held it, with such reverence and care, caused Ananda to pause in his morning preparations. The woman's voice was soft, but clear as mountain air when she spoke. She explained that circumstances had forced her to part with this bowl, her only remaining possession of value. She asked not for gold or silver, but simply for enough rice to sustain her through the coming winter months. Her request was modest, her manner dignified, despite her obvious need. Ananda examined the bowl with the practiced eye of one who had handled countless treasures. To his assessment, it appeared to be nothing more than common bronze, worked by an adequate but unremarkable craftsman. The metal showed its age, and there seemed to be no hidden beauty waiting to emerge from beneath the patina of years. By all logical measures, the bowl was worth far less than the rice the woman requested. Yet something stirred within the merchant's heart as he held the simple vessel. Perhaps it was the dignity with which the woman had presented her request, or the way her weathered hands had trembled slightly as she unwrapped her precious burden. Whatever the cause, Ananda found himself agreeing to the trade, giving the old woman not only enough rice for the winter, but additional provisions that would see her through many months in comfort. As the woman departed, blessing the merchant with words of gratitude that seemed to carry unusual weight, Ananda set the bowl aside with his other acquisitions. Days passed, and the humble vessel remained largely forgotten among the more striking items that attracted his customers' attention. The bowl gathered dust in a corner of his stall, overlooked by buyers drawn to more obviously valuable goods. It was a travelling monk who first noticed something unusual about the forgotten bowl. Brother Mahinda had spent years in meditation and study, training his senses to perceive subtleties that escaped ordinary awareness. As he browsed the merchant's wares in search of a simple vessel for his temple, his attention was drawn to the tarnished bronze bowl sitting quietly in its corner. With gentle reverence, the monk lifted the bowl and examined it closely. Then, to Ananda's surprise, Brother Mahinda struck the rim lightly with a small wooden mallet he carried among his few possessions. The sound that emerged was unlike anything the merchant had ever heard. Clear and pure, the tone seemed to contain within it all the harmony of the universe, resonating with such perfect pitch and sustaining power that both men stood transfixed in its presence. The bowl continued to sing long after the initial strike, its voice growing neither louder nor softer, but maintaining its perfect clarity as it filled the marketplace with an almost supernatural beauty. Other merchants stopped their haggling to listen. Customers paused in their browsing, their faces transformed by wonder. Children ceased their playing and stood perfectly still, as if the sound spoke directly to some deep wisdom within their young hearts. As the ethereal tone finally faded into silence, Brother Mahinda smiled with the joy of one who has discovered a treasure beyond earthly measure. He explained to the astonished merchant that this was no ordinary bowl, but a singing bowl of the finest quality, crafted by masters whose knowledge had been lost to time. Such vessels were created not merely as objects of beauty, but as tools for meditation and spiritual practice, their pure tones capable of quieting the most agitated mind and opening the heart to profound states of inner peace. The monk offered to purchase the bowl, naming a price that made Ananda's eyes widen with surprise. The amount suggested was more than the merchant typically earned in several months of trading, enough to secure his family's comfort for years to come. Yet as Brother Mahinda prepared to complete the transaction, something unexpected stirred within the merchant's heart. For the first time since acquiring the bowl, Ananda truly understood what the elderly woman had sacrificed when she parted with this treasure. He realized that she had given up not merely a valuable object, but a source of daily beauty and spiritual nourishment, trading her most precious possession simply to survive another season. The knowledge of her sacrifice weighed heavily upon his conscience, transforming his understanding of their original exchange. Without hesitation, Ananda declined the monk's generous offer. Instead, he carefully wrapped the singing bowl in the finest silk cloth from his collection and set out to find the elderly woman. He searched through the narrow streets and humble quarters where the poor made their homes, asking after her whereabouts with growing urgency. His heart would not be at peace until he had returned her treasure and made right the imbalance their trade had created. When he finally located the woman's small dwelling, he found her sitting peacefully in her garden, tending to a few simple vegetables with the same loving care she had once shown her precious bowl. Her face lit with gentle surprise when she saw the merchant approaching, carrying his carefully wrapped bundle with obvious reverence. Ananda knelt before the elderly woman and unwrapped the singing bowl, placing it gently in her weathered hands. He explained what he had learned about its true nature and value, and begged her forgiveness for accepting such a treasure in exchange for mere provisions. He insisted that she keep both the bowl and the supplies he had given her, refusing to take back even a single grain of rice despite her protests. The old woman's eyes filled with tears of gratitude, but not for the material value of what had been returned to her. She wept because she recognized in the merchant's actions the flowering of compassion and wisdom that transforms ordinary business into sacred exchange. She had known all along the true worth of her bowl, just as she had recognized the good heart hidden beneath Ananda's practical exterior. That evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, the woman struck her bowl once more. Its pure, clear tone rang out across the marketplace, blessing all who heard it with a moment of perfect peace. Ananda, listening from his own home nearby, felt something shift within his understanding of wealth and value, of giving and receiving, of the hidden treasures that exist all around us when we learn to see with eyes of wisdom. From that day forward, the merchant's approach to his trade was transformed. He began to look beyond surface appearances, seeking not only goods that would bring profit, but items that carried stories of human dignity and hidden beauty. His customers noticed the change, finding themselves drawn not merely to his wares, but to the quality of presence he brought to each transaction. The elderly woman continued to live simply in her small dwelling, but her daily life was enriched by the pure tones of her singing bowl. Each morning and evening, she would strike its rim and allow its perfect voice to carry her into states of meditation that connected her with the deepest peace of her being. The bowl's music became a gift to her entire neighborhood, marking the transitions of day and night with moments of transcendent beauty. Years passed, and the story of the merchant and the singing bowl spread throughout the region, carried by travelers and pilgrims who had witnessed the power of genuine compassion in action. The tale became a teaching story, told in monasteries and family gatherings, reminding listeners that true wealth cannot be measured in gold or silver, but in the moments when we choose wisdom over cleverness, generosity over greed, and recognition of others' dignity over mere personal gain. Brother Mahinda, who had first recognized the bowl's true nature, often reflected on the deeper lesson contained within this encounter. He understood that the singing bowl itself was merely a symbol, representing the hidden treasures that exist within every human heart. Like the bowl, these inner riches often remain unrecognized, covered by the dust of daily concerns and the patina of accumulated sorrows. The pure tone that emerged when the bowl was properly struck represented the clear voice of wisdom that exists within each being, waiting to be awakened through the gentle touch of mindful awareness. Just as the bowl required the right conditions to reveal its song, so too does the human spirit need the proper environment of compassion and understanding to manifest its inherent beauty. In quiet monasteries across the land, monks would tell this story to young novices struggling to understand the true meaning of renunciation and generosity. They would explain that Ananda's transformation from clever merchant to wise benefactor illustrated the journey every sincere practitioner must undertake, moving from the pursuit of external treasures to the recognition of inner wealth. The tale reminded listeners that every encounter carries within it the potential for awakening if we approach our daily interactions with the same reverence the monk showed for the humble bowl. Each person we meet may be carrying treasures we cannot immediately perceive, gifts that reveal themselves only when we learn to listen with the ears of compassion and see with the eyes of wisdom. As our first story draws to its gentle close, allow its message to settle into the quiet depths of your being. Like the pure tone of the singing bowl, may these words resonate within your consciousness, creating ripples of peace that extend far beyond this moment of listening. The merchant's journey from blindness to recognition mirrors the path we all must walk. Learning to value what truly matters and to see the sacred hidden within the ordinary circumstances of our daily lives. Rest now in the understanding that you too carry within yourself treasures beyond imagining, waiting only for the right moment and the proper touch to reveal their perfect song to the world. The world. As the echoes of our first tale fade into the gentle silence of your deepening rest, let us turn to another story from the ancient treasury of Buddhist wisdom. This is the tale of the water carrier and the cracked pot, a story that reveals how our perceived imperfections may actually be the source of our greatest gifts to the world. In a village nestled between rolling hills and fertile valleys, there lived a water carrier named Deepak, who served the local monastery with unwavering dedication. Each morning before dawn, he would make his way to the crystal-clear spring that bubbled up from the earth at the base of the nearest hill. There he would fill 2 large earthenware pots, suspending them from either end of a sturdy wooden pole that he carried across his shoulders. The journey from the spring to the monastery was neither short nor easy. The path wound upward through groves of ancient trees, across streams that danced over smooth stones, and along terraces where farmers tended their crops with patient devotion. For many years, Deepak had walked this route twice daily, morning and evening, carrying the precious water that sustained the community of monks in their life of contemplation and service. Of his 2 water pots, one was perfect in every way. Its walls were smooth and uniform, its shape elegantly balanced, and not a single drop of water escaped from its confines during the long journey to the monastery. This pot took great pride in its flawless construction and the praise it received from the monks who admired its craftsmanship when Deepak arrived with his daily delivery. The second pot, however, bore a hairline crack that ran from its rim nearly to its base. This flaw had appeared gradually over months of faithful service, perhaps caused by the daily expansion and contraction of the clay under the sun's heat, or by the gentle stress of countless journeys along the winding mountain path. Whatever its origin, the crack allowed a steady stream of water to seep out during each trip, so that by the time Deepak reached the monastery, this pot contained only half the water it had held when filled at the spring. As the seasons turned and the crack grew slightly wider, the imperfect pot became increasingly ashamed of its condition. It watched with growing despair as its perfect companion delivered its full measure of water each day, receiving grateful acknowledgement from the monks and admiring glances from visitors to the monastery. Meanwhile, the cracked pot could only offer half its intended gift, leaving a thin trail of wasted water along the dusty path behind them. The weight of this shame grew heavier with each passing day. The cracked pot began to believe that it was failing in its fundamental purpose, that its very existence had become a burden rather than a blessing. It tortured itself with thoughts of inadequacy, imagining that Deepak would surely replace it once he realized how much water was being lost through its damaged walls. One morning, as they made their usual journey from the spring, the cracked pot could no longer contain its anguish. In a voice heavy with sorrow, it spoke to the water carrier who had served it so faithfully for so many years. The pot confessed its shame, apologizing for its imperfection and begging forgiveness for the water that was lost each day through its damaged walls. It offered to withdraw from service, suggesting that Deepak would be better served by 2 perfect vessels, rather than one whole pot and one broken one. Deepak listened to these words with the gentle attention he brought to all aspects of his work. When the pot had finished its sorrowful confession, the water carrier smiled with the warmth of one who sees clearly beyond surface appearances. Instead of responding with words, he invited the cracked pot to observe something that it had never noticed during all their years of traveling together. As they walked along the familiar path, Deepak drew the pot's attention to the ground beneath their feet. There, along the route where the cracked pot's water had fallen day after day, a magnificent garden had grown. Wildflowers bloomed in profusion, their colours painting the pathway with beauty that took the breath away. Ancient trees had extended their roots to drink from the steady moisture, growing taller and stronger than their companions in drier soil. Birds nested in these flourishing branches, filling the morning air with songs of joy and gratitude. Butterflies danced from blossom to blossom, their wings catching the sunlight like living jewels. Small creatures found shelter and sustenance in this unplanned paradise that had grown up along the water carrier's route, creating an entire ecosystem of life and beauty that would not have existed without the cracked pot's daily gift. Deepak explained to the astonished pot that he had been aware of the crack from its very beginning. Far from seeing it as a flaw to be corrected or a reason for replacement, he had come to understand it as a unique gift that allowed this humble vessel to serve in ways that its perfect companion never could. While the whole pot delivered water efficiently to its intended destination, the cracked pot had been creating something entirely different and equally valuable along the journey. The water carrier revealed that he had actually chosen the path they travelled, specifically because of the cracked pot's contribution. He had observed how the steady drip of water was transforming the landscape, bringing life to places that had been dry and barren. Over time, he had adjusted their route slightly to ensure that the leaked water would reach the areas most in need of moisture, creating an irrigation system that was both accidental and perfect in its design. Monks from the monastery had begun to incorporate this blooming pathway into their walking meditations, finding that the beauty created by the cracked pot's imperfection helped quiet their minds and open their hearts to deeper contemplation. Pilgrims travelling to the monastery often remarked on the unexpected garden that graced their approach, arriving with spirits already lifted by the beauty they had encountered along the way. As the cracked pot absorbed this revelation, its understanding of purpose and perfection underwent a fundamental transformation. It began to realize that its perceived failure had actually been a form of success that it had been too limited in vision to recognize. The water it had believed was wasted had actually been perfectly placed, creating gifts that no amount of efficient delivery could have achieved. From that day forward, the cracked pot's relationship with its imperfection changed completely. Instead of shame, it felt a quiet pride in its unique contribution to the world. Instead of trying to minimize the water that seeped through its walls, it began to offer its gift with intentionality and joy, knowing that each drop was falling exactly where it was most needed. The perfect pot, witnessing this transformation in its companion, began to reflect more deeply on the nature of service and contribution. It realized that while its own efficiency was valuable, it had perhaps been too focused on its individual performance to consider the larger picture of how their combined efforts served the world. The cracked pot's example taught it that there were many ways to be useful, many forms of perfection that extended beyond flawless execution of a single task. Years passed, and the garden along the water carrier's path became legendary throughout the region. Travelers would detour from their planned routes simply to walk the flower-lined pathway that led to the monastery. The beauty created by one pot's imperfection had become a source of inspiration and joy for countless beings, demonstrating that what we perceive as our greatest weaknesses may actually be the very qualities that allow us to serve in the most meaningful ways. The monks of the monastery began using this story in their teachings, helping students understand that the spiritual path is not about achieving some impossible standard of perfection, but about discovering how our authentic selves, including all our apparent flaws and limitations, can become vehicles for expressing the deepest truths of existence. They would remind their listeners that the Buddha himself had taught that every being possesses Buddha nature, the inherent capacity for awakening and enlightenment. This nature is not diminished by our human imperfections, but often reveals itself most clearly through the very qualities we might wish to hide or change about ourselves. The tale of the water carrier and the cracked pot became a favorite story for parents to share with children who struggled with feelings of inadequacy or difference. It helped young ones understand that their unique qualities, even those that seemed to set them apart from their peers, might actually be their greatest gifts to the world when viewed from a broader perspective. In meditation halls across many lands, practitioners would contemplate this story when they encountered their own inner critics, those voices that insisted they were somehow failing in their spiritual practice because they had not achieved some imagined state of perfection. The cracked pot's journey from shame to recognition reminded them that the path itself, with all its apparent stumbles and detours, might be creating beauty in ways they could not yet perceive. Artists and craftspeople found particular inspiration in this tale, recognizing that the most memorable and moving works often emerge not from technical perfection, but from the honest expression of the creator's authentic vision, including all the quirks and imperfections that made their perspective unique. They learned to see the cracks in their work not as failures, but as opportunities for light to enter and beauty to emerge in unexpected ways. As this second story settles into the quiet chambers of your heart, allow its wisdom to gently illuminate any places within yourself that you have judged as flawed or inadequate. Like the cracked pot's steady drip of water, your own perceived imperfections may be creating gardens of beauty and meaning in ways that perfect efficiency never could. Consider how many times in your own life you may have been like the cracked pot, focusing so intently on what you believed you were failing to deliver that you could not see the flowers blooming in your wake. Remember that your authentic self, complete with all its cracks and imperfections, may be exactly what the world needs to create something beautiful and unexpected. Rest now in the understanding that your journey through life, with all its apparent detours and disappointments, may be watering seeds that will bloom into gifts beyond your current ability to imagine. Trust that your path, exactly as it is, serves purposes that extend far beyond your individual perspective, contributing to a larger pattern of meaning and beauty that encompasses us all. Our third story emerges from the mists of ancient wisdom, carrying us to a time when the boundaries between the seen and unseen worlds were thin, and truth revealed itself through the most ordinary encounters. This is the tale of the monk and the thief, a story that illuminates how acts of unconditional kindness can transform both the giver and receiver in ways that logic alone could never predict. High in the mountains where the air was thin and pure, there lived a monk named Tenzin, who had dedicated his life to the simplest form of existence. His dwelling was nothing more than a small cave that he had lined with prayer flags and furnished with only the most essential items: a meditation cushion, a water bowl, a few worn texts, and the single robe that clothed his body. He owned nothing of material value, yet his days were filled with a richness that gold could never purchase. Tenzin's routine was as regular as the rising and setting of the sun. Each morning before dawn, he would sit in meditation as the world awakened around him. As the first light painted the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold, he would venture out to gather wild herbs and roots for his simple meals. His afternoons were spent in study and contemplation, reading the ancient texts that had been passed down through countless generations of seekers. When evening fell, he would offer prayers for all beings before retiring to his humble bed of woven grass. One night, when the mountain winds howled with particular ferocity and snow began to fall in thick, silent curtains, Tenzin was deep in meditation when he became aware of movement outside his cave. The sound was subtle, barely distinguishable from the natural creaking of trees and shifting of stones that accompanied every mountain storm. But his years of practice had sharpened his senses to detect even the slightest disturbance in his environment. A figure appeared at the entrance to his cave, silhouetted against the swirling snow. The man was clearly in distress, his clothes torn and inadequate for the harsh mountain weather, his movements speaking of exhaustion and desperation. What struck Tenzin most immediately, however, was the wild look in the stranger's eyes and the crude knife he clutched in his trembling hand. The intruder stepped into the cave's warmth, his breath forming clouds in the cold air as he surveyed the monk's meager possessions. His gaze darted from corner to corner, searching for anything of value that might justify his dangerous journey up the treacherous mountain path in the middle of a fierce storm. What he found instead was a scene of such profound simplicity that it seemed to mock his criminal intentions. Without rising from his meditation posture, Tenzin regarded the thief with eyes that held no trace of fear or anger. When he spoke, his voice was as calm and welcoming as if he were greeting an expected guest rather than confronting an armed intruder who had invaded his sacred space. "You have traveled far on such a terrible night," the monk said gently. "You must be cold and hungry. Please, sit by my fire and warm yourself while I prepare some tea." The thief stood frozen in confusion, his knife still raised, but his purpose suddenly unclear. He had prepared himself for resistance, for pleas or bargaining, for any of the reactions he had encountered during his previous crimes. He had not prepared himself for hospitality so genuine that it seemed to transform the very nature of their encounter. Tenzin moved with unhurried grace to kindle his small fire, adding precious fuel that he normally conserved carefully through the long mountain winter. He filled his single pot with water from his store and set it to heat, then began gathering the few edible items his cave contained. The entire time, he maintained a gentle commentary about the storm, the beauty of the mountain in winter, and the challenges faced by all creatures seeking shelter on such a harsh night. As the tea steeped and filled the cave with its warming fragrance, the monk noticed that his visitor was shivering uncontrollably. Without hesitation, Tenzin removed his outer robe and offered it to the bewildered thief, leaving himself clothed only in the thin inner garment that provided minimal protection against the mountain cold. "Please," he said, draping the warm wool around the stranger's shoulders. "This robe has served me well, but tonight it seems you have greater need of its comfort than I do." The thief found himself accepting the offered warmth, his numb fingers clutching the soft fabric as if it were a lifeline. The robe carried the scent of mountain herbs and wood smoke, along with something else he could not identify, a quality of peace that seemed to seep into his very bones, along with the physical warmth. As they shared the simple meal of barley tea and dried fruit, the thief began to speak of his circumstances. The words tumbled out as if released by the monk's gentle presence, telling of debts that had driven him to desperation, of a sick child whose medicine cost more than an honest man could earn, of choices that had seemed reasonable in the harsh light of necessity, but now appeared as the confused actions of a lost soul. Tenzin listened without judgment, occasionally offering a word of understanding or a question that helped the man clarify his thoughts. As the night progressed, the cave filled with a quality of communion that neither man had expected. The storm outside seemed to create a cocoon of intimacy around them, as if they were the only two beings in existence, sharing truths that could only be spoken in such extraordinary circumstances. When dawn finally broke and the storm began to subside, the thief found himself facing a choice he had never anticipated. The monk's few possessions lay within easy reach, unguarded and undefended. The man who owned them had shown such trust that he had fallen peacefully asleep, despite the presence of an armed stranger in his sanctuary. By all logic, this should have been the perfect opportunity to complete his original mission. Instead, the thief found himself carefully covering the sleeping monk with a blanket, ensuring that his benefactor would remain warm in the growing cold of dawn. He placed his knife on the ground near the cave entrance, no longer able to imagine using it as a weapon against someone who had shown him such unconditional kindness. As he prepared to leave, the thief noticed that Tenzin had awakened and was watching him with the same gentle attention he had shown throughout the night. There was no suspicion in the monk's gaze, no relief at seeing the danger apparently past, only a continued expression of genuine care and interest in his guest's well-being. "The path down the mountain can be treacherous after a storm," Tenzin observed quietly. "Perhaps you should wait until the sun has had time to melt the fresh ice on the rocks." The offer of continued hospitality broke something open in the thief's heart. He fell to his knees before the monk, tears streaming down his weathered face, as he confessed not only his original intention to rob the cave, but the long history of crimes that had brought him to this moment. He begged forgiveness for his planned betrayal of the trust he had been shown, expecting condemnation or at least disappointment from the man he had intended to harm. Instead, Tenzin's response was one of profound compassion. He helped the weeping man to his feet and embraced him as a brother, acknowledging that desperation could drive anyone to actions they would not normally consider. He spoke of the courage it had taken to confess his intentions and of the transformation he had witnessed occurring throughout their night together. The monk then did something that completed the thief's inner revolution. He pressed a small pouch into the man's hands, explaining that it contained the modest sum he had been saving for necessary repairs to his meditation texts. He insisted that the money be used for the sick child's medicine, and he offered his own prayers for the family's healing and prosperity. More than the material gift, however, was what Tenzin offered next. He invited the transformed thief to return to the mountain whenever life became overwhelming, promising that the cave would always provide sanctuary for one who sought to change his path. He spoke of the possibility of redemption that exists within every human heart, and of the power of a single moment of genuine connection to reshape an entire life. As the former thief made his way down the mountain path, no longer burdened by criminal intent, but carrying instead the weight of unexpected grace, he found that his perspective on everything had shifted. The same landscape that had seemed threatening and hostile during his desperate ascent now appeared beautiful and welcoming, and birds sang in the trees that lined his path, their voices seeming to celebrate his transformation. In the months that followed, the man's life underwent changes that amazed all who knew him. He found honest work despite his criminal record, speaking truthfully about his past, but demonstrating through his actions the sincerity of his desire to live differently. The medicine purchased with the monk's gift restored his child's health, and the gratitude he felt inspired him to help others facing similar desperate circumstances. Word of his transformation spread through the valleys below the mountain, carried by travelers who marveled at the change they witnessed in a man they had once feared. The story grew in the telling, becoming a legend that parents shared with their children and that merchants discussed around their evening fires. Some of these travelers were inspired to seek out the monk whose kindness had catalyzed such remarkable change. They climbed the difficult mountain path hoping to receive teachings or blessings from one who possessed such transformative power. What they found instead was a simple man who insisted that the power had belonged to the thief all along, waiting only for the right conditions to manifest. Tenzin would explain to his visitors that every being possesses the capacity for both harm and healing, for selfishness and generosity, for fear and love. The difference lies not in some inherent quality that separates good people from bad, but in the circumstances that call forth one aspect of our nature rather than another. By treating the thief as he would treat an honored guest, he had simply created conditions that allowed the man's better nature to emerge. The monk's teaching extended beyond the specific encounter with the thief to encompass a broader understanding of how we might engage with all the difficult people and challenging situations we encounter in our daily lives. He suggested that our response to others' harmful actions could either reinforce their destructive patterns or create opportunities for transformation that benefits everyone involved. Years later, when the former thief had become a respected member of his community and a source of help for others who had lost their way, he would make regular pilgrimages up the mountain to visit the monk who had changed his life. These meetings were celebrations of the ongoing miracle of transformation, reminders that no one is beyond redemption when met with genuine compassion and understanding. The cave that had witnessed their initial encounter became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the practical power of unconditional love. Visitors would sit in the same spot where a desperate criminal had been transformed into a force for good, contemplating the mysterious alchemy that can occur when fear is met with fearlessness and hatred is answered with hospitality. As this third story finds its resting place within your consciousness, Consider the thieves in your own life. Perhaps not literal criminals, but those who seem to steal your peace, your energy, or your faith in human goodness. Reflect on how the monk's response to his midnight visitor might inform your own encounters with those who challenge you or cause you distress. The true teaching of this tale lies not in any expectation that kindness will always produce dramatic transformations, but in the recognition that our response to others' darkness can either add to the world's burden of fear and resentment or contribute to its capacity for healing and hope. Like Tenzin offering his robe to a shivering stranger, we each have opportunities to choose generosity over self-protection, understanding over judgment, and love over fear. Rest now in the understanding that within every challenging encounter lies the potential for unexpected grace, both for yourself and for those who seem to oppose you. The thief's knife became irrelevant in the presence of genuine warmth, just as the weapons others carry against us lose their power when met with the disarming force of authentic compassion. Our fourth tale carries us across vast deserts and through bustling cities to a small workshop where an elderly craftsman labored over his art with the patience of one who understood that true mastery cannot be rushed. This is the story of the potter and the perfect vessel, a teaching about the paradox of seeking perfection and the wisdom found in accepting what emerges naturally from our sincere efforts. Master Chen had spent more than 50 years working with clay, his hands growing increasingly skilled at coaxing beauty from the earth's most humble material. His workshop sat at the edge of a prosperous city, where merchants and nobles competed to acquire pieces bearing his distinctive mark. Chen's pottery was renowned throughout the land for its elegant proportions and flawless execution, each piece reflecting decades of accumulated knowledge and refined technique. Despite his reputation and the prosperity his skill had brought him, Master Chen harbored a secret dissatisfaction that grew stronger with each passing year. In his youth, he had dreamed of creating a single perfect vessel, a piece so flawless in its conception and execution that it would stand as the ultimate expression of the potter's art. This dream had sustained him through years of apprenticeship and guided his hand through countless hours of practice. Yet the perfect vessel remained elusive. Every pot that emerged from his kiln, no matter how beautiful or technically accomplished, revealed some tiny flaw to his practiced eye. A slight asymmetry in the rim, an almost imperceptible variation in the glaze, a curve that deviated by the smallest fraction from his intended line. To others, these pieces appeared perfect, but Chen saw only their shortcomings, the ways in which they fell short of the impossible standard that existed in his imagination. As his 70th year approached, Chen decided to make one final attempt at achieving his lifelong goal. He selected the finest clay from his carefully hoarded stores, material that had aged for decades in his workshop's cool depths. He prepared his workspace with ritualistic attention to detail, ensuring that every tool was perfectly clean and positioned exactly where his muscle memory expected to find it. For weeks, Chen contemplated the form his perfect vessel would take. Should it be a simple bowl that captured the essence of pure function, or a more complex piece that demonstrated the full range of his technical abilities? He sketched countless designs, meditating on each possibility until he finally settled on a water jar of moderate size, its form inspired by the classical proportions that had guided master potters for centuries. On the morning he had chosen to begin, Chen rose before dawn and purified himself with careful attention to both body and mind. He approached his potter's wheel with the solemnity of a priest approaching an altar, knowing that this might be his final opportunity to achieve the dream that had shaped his entire career. His hands, weathered by decades of work, trembled slightly as he centered the clay on the spinning wheel. What followed was a display of mastery that seemed to transcend ordinary human capability. Chen's movements flowed with the unconscious grace of one who had repeated these motions thousands of times, each gesture informed by decades of accumulated wisdom. The clay responded to his touch as if it were a living thing eager to take the shape he envisioned, rising and expanding under his palms with perfect obedience to his intentions. Hour after hour, Chen worked with total concentration, adjusting and refining the emerging form with the precision of a master craftsman and the intuition of an artist. He paused frequently to study the vessel from different angles, making minute corrections that would be invisible to anyone else but were crucial to his vision of perfection. The walls grew thin and even, the proportions achieved exactly the harmony he had calculated, and the surface remained flawlessly smooth under his experienced touch. As the sun reached its zenith, Chen stepped back to examine his work. The water jar sat before him like a meditation on pure form, its curves flowing with mathematical precision from base to neck to rim. Every measurement corresponded exactly to his carefully planned specifications. Every surface showed the mirror smoothness that spoke of complete technical control. For the first time in his long career, Chen could detect no obvious flaw in a piece fresh from his wheel. With infinite care, he transferred the unfired vessel to his drying room, where it would slowly give up its moisture over the course of several days. During this waiting period, Chen found himself returning repeatedly to study his creation, searching for any imperfection that might have escaped his initial examination. Each inspection confirmed his growing excitement that he had finally achieved the perfection he had sought for so long. The firing process required even greater attention and care. Chen prepared his kiln with the same meticulous precision he had brought to the shaping, calculating temperatures, and timing with the expertise of decades. He selected only the finest wood for fuel, ensuring that the heat would rise and fall according to the precise schedule that would transform his clay masterpiece into permanent ceramic perfection. For 3 days and nights, Chen tended his kiln with sleepless devotion, monitoring the flames and adjusting the airflow with the skill of a master conductor, directing a complex symphony. He knew that even the smallest error in temperature or timing could destroy weeks of work, reducing his perfect vessel to worthless shards. The responsibility weighed heavily on his aged shoulders, but his commitment to his dream kept him vigilant through every crucial hour. When the kiln finally cooled sufficiently to be opened, Chen approached with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation that made his heart race like a young apprentice's. Steam rose from the opening as he carefully removed the protective bricks that sealed the firing chamber. Through the dissipating heat shimmer, he caught his first glimpse of the vessel that would either fulfill his lifelong dream or confirm once again that perfection remained beyond his reach. The water jar sat exactly where he had placed it, apparently intact and unchanged by its trial by fire. As Chen lifted it from the kiln with trembling hands, his initial inspection revealed everything he had hoped to find. The glaze had matured to exactly the depth and color he had envisioned, flowing evenly across every surface without the slightest irregularity. The firing had enhanced rather than diminished the vessel's perfect proportions, and not a single crack or blemish marred its flawless surface. Chen carried his achievement into the afternoon sunlight, where natural illumination would reveal any defects that the kiln's shadows might have concealed. He turned the vessel slowly in his hands, examining every inch with the critical eye that had detected flaws in thousands of previous pieces. The more closely he studied his work, the more convinced he became that he had finally achieved the impossible dream that had driven him for more than half a century. That evening, Chen placed the perfect vessel on a special shelf in his workshop, positioning it where the morning light would illuminate its flawless form. For the first time in years, he slept deeply and without the restless dreams that usually accompanied his work. He had achieved what he had believed might be impossible, creating something that met even his impossibly high standards for technical and artistic perfection. Yet in the days that followed, Chen found himself experiencing an unexpected emptiness rather than the profound satisfaction he had anticipated. He would stand before his perfect vessel for long periods, studying its flawless form and searching within himself for the joy and fulfillment he had expected to feel. Instead, he discovered a strange hollowness, as if achieving his ultimate goal had somehow drained his work of meaning rather than completing it. The perfect vessel began to feel less like a triumph and more like an ending, a final statement that left no room for further exploration or growth. Chen realized that the pursuit of perfection had provided structure and purpose to his entire career, giving direction to his studies and inspiration to his efforts. Now that he had apparently reached his destination, he found himself questioning what lay beyond this moment of achievement. Weeks passed before Chen understood the deeper lesson his perfect vessel was teaching him. One morning, as he stood contemplating his creation in the early light, a young apprentice from a neighboring workshop arrived seeking guidance on a technical problem. The boy's hands were stained with clay and his eyes bright with the enthusiasm of one just beginning to discover the potter's art. As Chen watched the young man examine the perfect vessel with wonder and admiration, he began to see his creation through fresh eyes. What struck him most powerfully was not the technical mastery the piece displayed, but the way it seemed to exist in isolation from the messy, imperfect process of human creativity that had brought it into being. The vessel's perfection had somehow separated it from the living tradition of craft that connected master to apprentice across generations. Chen realized that his most valued possessions were not his most perfect pieces, but rather the works that carried stories within their forms. The slightly lopsided bowl that had emerged from his first successful firing as a young apprentice, the vase with the subtle color variation that had taught him about glaze chemistry, the cup with the small chip that reminded him of a dear friend who had broken it accidentally during a memorable conversation. These imperfect pieces held meaning that transcended their technical shortcomings because they connected him to specific moments in his journey as both craftsman and human being. They were part of the continuing story of his life, markers of growth and change and relationship that gave context and significance to his work. The perfect vessel, for all its flawless beauty, seemed to exist outside this narrative of connection and meaning. In the months that followed this realization, Chen's approach to his craft underwent a subtle but profound transformation. He continued to pursue excellence in his work, but he no longer sought to eliminate every trace of the human hand that shaped each piece. Instead, he began to appreciate the slight irregularities and unexpected variations that emerge naturally from the dynamic interaction between intention and material, between skill and spontaneity. His new pieces retained all the technical mastery he had accumulated over decades of practice, but they also carried a quality of aliveness that his pursuit of perfection had sometimes suppressed. Customers noticed the change, often commenting that his recent work seemed to possess an additional dimension of beauty that complemented rather than competed with its obvious technical accomplishments. Chen began teaching again after years of focusing solely on his own work, sharing not only techniques and methods, but also the deeper wisdom he had gained from his encounter with perfection. He would tell his students about the perfect vessel that sat in his workshop, explaining how its achievement had taught him that the goal of craft was not to eliminate the human element, but to express it with increasing skill and authenticity. The perfect vessel itself became a teaching tool, a reminder to Chen and his students that technical mastery was only one aspect of true artistry. It demonstrated what was possible when skill and intention aligned completely, but it also illustrated the limitations of pursuing perfection as an end in itself, rather than as a means of deeper expression and connection. Visitors to Chen's workshop would often notice the perfect vessel on its special shelf, and many would assume it was his most treasured creation. Chen would smile at this assumption and explain that the vessel's greatest value lay not in its perfection, but in what it had taught him about the nature of creativity and the purpose of human endeavor. He would point out that the pursuit of perfection had been necessary to develop his skills and understanding, just as the achievement of perfection had been necessary to reveal its limitations. The journey toward the perfect vessel had been as important as its creation, providing decades of purpose and growth that had shaped not only his abilities, but his character and wisdom. As our fourth story settles into the quiet spaces of your mind, consider the perfect vessels you may be pursuing in your own life. Perhaps they take the form of ideal relationships, flawless career achievements, or spiritual states free from all difficulty and doubt. Like Master Chen's water jar, these goals may serve important purposes in motivating growth and development, but their ultimate value may lie in what they teach us about the journey rather than their achievement as destinations. Reflect on the imperfect aspects of your life that you might be tempted to eliminate or improve, and consider whether some of these seeming flaws might actually be sources of meaning and connection that perfection could never provide. The slight asymmetries in your personality, the small scars left by life's challenges, the gentle imperfections that mark you as uniquely human, may be exactly what allows others to recognize and relate to your authentic self. Rest now in the understanding that your life's meaning emerges not from achieving some impossible standard of perfection, but from the sincerity and presence you bring to each moment of the ongoing creative process. Like clay responding to the potter's touch, allow yourself to be shaped by experience, while maintaining the essential quality that makes your contribution to the world irreplaceably your own. Our fifth story draws us into the heart of an ancient forest, where towering trees had stood for centuries, their roots intertwined beneath the earth and their branches reaching toward the same sun. This is the tale of the two trees and the storm, a story that reveals how apparent weakness can become the source of unexpected strength, and how flexibility serves life better than rigid resistance to change. In a forest so ancient that its origins had passed beyond memory into legend, two magnificent trees grew side by side in a small clearing where sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden streams. These trees had sprouted from seeds carried by the wind in the same season, taking root within arm's reach of each other when the world was younger and the forest stretched unbroken across vast continents. The first tree, which the forest creatures had come to call the iron oak, had grown with unwavering determination toward the sky. Its trunk was massive and straight, its bark thick and deeply furrowed, its branches extending in perfect symmetry like the arms of a giant reaching confidently toward the heavens. Every aspect of its growth seemed to proclaim strength and permanence, as if it had been carved from living stone by some master sculptor who understood the very essence of endurance. Generation after generation of forest dwellers had marveled at the iron oak's impressive stature. Birds built their nests in its sturdy branches, knowing that the tree would never bend or sway enough to disturb their young. Travelers resting in its shade would run their hands along its mighty trunk, drawing comfort from its apparent indestructibility. The tree had become a landmark and symbol, representing all that was stable and unchanging in a world of constant transformation. Beside the iron oak grew its companion, a tree of the same species but remarkably different in character. This second tree, known throughout the forest as the dancing willow despite its oak heritage, had followed a path of growth that seemed to embrace rather than resist the forces that shaped forest life. Its trunk curved gracefully, following the subtle influences of wind and weather that had touched it throughout its long existence. Where the iron oak's branches reached straight and true toward predetermined destinations, the dancing willow's limbs curved and twisted in patterns that seemed almost musical in their flowing lines. Its bark remained smoother and more flexible than its rigid companions, and its entire form seemed to pulse with a quality of aliveness that suggested movement even in perfect stillness. Many forest visitors found the dancing willow less impressive than its magnificent neighbor. Its curved trunk appeared weaker, its flowing branches seemed less purposeful, and its overall form lacked the commanding presence that made the iron oak such a memorable sight. Some observers wondered how such a seemingly fragile tree had managed to survive alongside such a powerful companion, assuming that it must exist in the iron oak's protective shadow. The two trees themselves, however, had developed a relationship of mutual respect and understanding that transcended surface appearances. through the mysterious communication that exists between all growing things. They had shared the experiences of countless seasons, supporting each other through droughts and floods, celebrations and sorrows. The endless cycle of growth and rest that marked the passage of forest time. The iron oak took pride in its strength and stability, viewing its rigid structure as the proper response to life's challenges. It had weathered many storms by standing firm, refusing to yield to winds that bent lesser trees to the breaking point. Its massive roots anchored it so deeply in the earth that it seemed to have become part of the very bedrock, immovable and eternal. The dancing willow, meanwhile, had learned to find strength in flexibility, allowing the forces of nature to flow through and around it rather than meeting them with direct resistance. When storms came, it would bend and sway in an intricate dance with the wind, its supple branches giving way just enough to avoid breaking, while its curved trunk absorbed and redirected the forces that might have shattered a more rigid structure. For decades, both approaches had served their respective trees well. The iron oak stood as a testament to the power of unwavering determination, while the dancing willow demonstrated the grace that could be found in adaptive responsiveness. Forest creatures benefited from both qualities, finding in the iron oak the security of permanence, and in the dancing willow the inspiration of fluid beauty. As the years accumulated into centuries, subtle changes began to occur in the forest ecosystem around them. The climate gradually shifted, bringing weather patterns that differed from those the trees had known in their youth. Storms arrived with increasing frequency and intensity, carrying winds that seemed to howl with a fury that previous generations of forest dwellers had never experienced. The iron oak met these new challenges as it had always met difficulties, with stoic resistance and unbending determination. It strengthened its grip on the earth, adding mass to its trunk and rigidity to its branches. Every fibre of its being was organised around the principle of standing firm against whatever forces might assail it, maintaining its position through sheer strength and stubborn refusal to yield. The dancing willow responded to the changing conditions by becoming even more flexible, developing new patterns of movement that allowed it to work with the increasingly powerful winds rather than against them. Its trunk learned to bend in directions it had never explored, and its branches discovered rhythms of motion that seemed to transform the most violent storms into elaborate choreographies of survival. One autumn evening, as the forest prepared for winter's approach, a storm arrived that surpassed anything either tree had previously encountered. The wind came not as the familiar gusts and breezes they knew, but as a sustained force of incredible power that seemed determined to reshape the entire landscape according to its own wild vision. The iron oak braced itself for battle, drawing upon centuries of accumulated strength to resist the storm's assault. Its massive trunk held firm as winds that would have uprooted smaller trees swirled around its base. Its thick branches, locked in rigid extension, faced the hurricane-force gusts with the determination of a warrior refusing to surrender ground to an advancing enemy. For hours, the iron oak's strategy seemed to be working. While other trees in the forest bent and swayed around it, some breaking under the pressure, the mighty oak stood like an island of stability in a sea of chaos. Its unwavering stance appeared to vindicate a lifetime of choosing strength over flexibility, resistance over accommodation. The dancing willow, meanwhile, entered into what appeared to be an elaborate dance with the storm itself. Its curved trunk swayed in great arcs that seemed impossible for any tree to survive, while its flexible branches moved in patterns so complex and fluid that they appeared almost liquid in the turbulent air. To observers, it looked as though the tree might be torn apart at any moment by the very forces it seemed to embrace. As the storm reached its peak intensity, something unexpected began to happen. The iron oak, which had stood firm for so many hours, began to show signs of stress that its rigid structure could not accommodate. The immense forces pressing against its unbending form were creating pressures within its trunk and branches that had no outlet. no means of release through movement or adjustment. Small cracks appeared in the iron oak's mighty bark, hairline fractures that spoke of internal stresses building beyond the tree's capacity to contain them. Its roots, anchored so deeply and inflexibly in the earth, began to experience forces that their rigid positioning could not absorb or redirect. The very strength that had sustained the tree for centuries was becoming a liability in the face of forces too great for even its impressive structure to resist. The dancing willow, by contrast, seemed to be finding new reserves of resilience as the storm intensified. Each gust of wind that might have broken a rigid structure was transformed into motion that allowed the tree to remain intact while accommodating forces that would have destroyed a less flexible form. Its curved trunk acted like a spring, absorbing tremendous energies and releasing them harmlessly through graceful movement. As dawn approached and the storm finally began to exhaust its fury, the two trees presented a sight that would be remembered by all who witnessed it. The iron oak, despite its magnificent size and apparent strength, had been broken by forces it could not bend to meet. Its massive trunk lay split and shattered, its rigid branches scattered across the forest floor, like the remnants of a great monument toppled by time and change. The dancing willow, though battered and stripped of many leaves, stood whole and alive in the growing light of morning. Its curved form appeared even more graceful for having survived such a trial, and new growth was already beginning to emerge from branches that had proven their ability to yield without breaking. The tree that had appeared weaker had demonstrated a form of strength that surpassed mere resistance. In the days that followed the great storm, forest creatures gathered around both trees to contemplate the lesson nature had provided. The iron oak's fallen form became a source of shelter and nourishment for countless smaller beings, its sacrifice contributing to the forest's ongoing life even in destruction. Its legacy lived on not only in the physical gifts it provided, but in the wisdom its fate had revealed about the limitations of rigid strength. The dancing willow became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand how apparent weakness might actually be strength, how flexibility might prove more durable than rigidity, and how working with natural forces might be wiser than fighting against them. Visitors would sit beneath its graceful canopy, studying the elegant curves that had allowed it to survive what brute strength could not withstand. Forest elders began telling the story of the two trees to young saplings just beginning their growth, helping them understand that there are many ways to be strong in the world. Some situations call for firm resistance and unwavering determination, they would explain, while others require the wisdom to bend without breaking, to find strength in adaptability rather than rigidity. The tale spread beyond the ancient forest, carried by travelers who had witnessed the aftermath of the great storm. It became a teaching story in distant lands, shared by parents with children who needed to learn about resilience, by teachers with students facing difficult challenges, and by elders with younger generations struggling to find their place in a changing world. Artists found inspiration in the image of the dancing willow, creating sculptures and paintings that captured the flowing lines of strength found in flexibility. Architects studied the tree's curved form, learning to design buildings that could withstand earthquakes and hurricanes by incorporating movement rather than resisting it. Engineers developed new technologies based on the principle that yielding at the right moment could prevent catastrophic failure. Philosophers and spiritual teachers used the story to explore deeper questions about the nature of strength and weakness, success and failure, permanence and change. They pointed out that the iron oak had not failed through any flaw in its character, but because it had applied an effective strategy beyond its appropriate limits. Its approach had served well for centuries before meeting conditions that required a different kind of response. The dancing willow's survival was not simply a victory of flexibility over rigidity, but a demonstration of wisdom in choosing the appropriate response to circumstances. The tree had not been weak or passive, but had actively engaged with the storm in a way that transformed destructive forces into a dance of survival. As this fifth story finds its place in the quiet depths of your consciousness, consider the storms in your own life and how you have chosen to meet them. Reflect on whether your natural tendency is toward the iron oak's approach of firm resistance or the dancing willow's strategy of flexible accommodation. Both have their place and purpose in the full spectrum of human response to challenge. Notice how some difficulties in your life may call for unwavering determination and refusal to compromise, while others might be better met with adaptability and willingness to change course when circumstances demand it. The wisdom lies not in always choosing one approach over the other, but in developing the sensitivity to recognize which response serves best in each unique situation. Consider also how your apparent weaknesses might actually be sources of unexpected strength. Just as the dancing willow's curves and flexibility proved more durable than the iron oak's impressive rigidity, the qualities about yourself that you might be tempted to straighten or strengthen might actually be perfect adaptations to the particular storms you are meant to weather in this life. Rest now in the understanding that true resilience comes not from never bending, but from knowing how to bend without breaking. Like the dancing willow swaying in harmony with forces too great to resist, you too can learn to find grace and strength in working with life's challenges, rather than exhausting yourself in futile opposition to them. Our sixth tale emerges from the bustling markets and quiet gardens of an ancient city, where the boundary between merchant and mystic was often thinner than the casual observer might suppose. This is the story of the merchant and the empty cart, a teaching about the paradox of fullness and emptiness, and how sometimes the most valuable cargo is that which cannot be seen or weighed. Rajesh had built his reputation as one of the most successful traders in the great commercial centre where three major trade routes converged. His caravans travelled regularly across vast distances, bringing exotic goods from distant lands to eager customers who valued both the quality of his merchandise and the reliability of his service. His warehouse overflowed with treasures from every corner of the known world, and his name was spoken with respect in marketplaces throughout the region. Despite his material success, Rajesh found himself increasingly troubled by a restlessness that no amount of profit seemed to satisfy. He had achieved everything he had dreamed of as a young man starting out in trade, yet something essential seemed to be missing from his life. The constant buying and selling, the endless calculations of profit and loss, the perpetual worry about market conditions and competition had begun to feel like a burden rather than the exciting adventure it had once represented. One morning, as Rajesh prepared for what promised to be his most profitable journey yet, he encountered an old sage sitting quietly beside the road that led out of the city. The man appeared to own nothing but the simple robes on his back and a wooden staff worn smooth by countless miles of travel. Yet there was something about his presence that commanded attention, a quality of stillness that seemed to create a pocket of peace in the midst of the bustling departure preparations. The sage observed Rajesh's heavily loaded caravan with interest, but without the covetous gleam that usually appeared in people's eyes when they saw such obvious wealth. Instead, his expression held a gentle curiosity that seemed to look beyond the visible cargo to something the merchant himself could not identify. When Rajesh paused in his supervisory duties to acknowledge the old man's presence, the sage spoke with a voice that carried the authority of deep experience. He asked a question that seemed simple on its surface, but lodged itself in the merchant's mind like a seed planted in fertile soil. The sage inquired whether Rajesh had ever considered what he might discover if he travelled with an empty cart instead of a full one. The question struck Rajesh as absurd at first. The entire purpose of his journeys was to transport goods from places where they were abundant to markets where they were scarce, profiting from the difference in value that distance and rarity created. An empty cart would serve no commercial purpose and would represent a complete waste of time and resources that could otherwise be generating income. Yet something about the sage's manner suggested that his question contained layers of meaning that were not immediately apparent. The old man's eyes held a depth that spoke of journeys beyond the merely physical, of discoveries that could not be catalogued in any merchant's inventory. When Rajesh attempted to dismiss the suggestion with practical objections, the sage simply smiled and wished him well on his travels, making no effort to argue or explain his cryptic recommendation. Throughout the successful completion of his trading expedition, Rajesh found himself returning repeatedly to the sage's strange question. During the long hours of travel across empty landscapes, when his mind was free to wander beyond immediate concerns, he would puzzle over what possible value could exist in an empty cart. The question seemed to point toward a different understanding of purpose and value that eluded his commercially trained thinking. Months passed, and Rajesh's business continued to flourish. Yet the old man's words had planted a seed of curiosity that grew stronger rather than weaker with time. The merchant began to notice aspects of his journeys that had previously escaped his attention, while he focused exclusively on the logistics of moving and selling goods. He observed how the landscape changed subtly with the seasons, how different communities had developed unique approaches to solving similar problems, how the rhythm of travel itself could become a form of meditation when not constantly interrupted by commercial concerns. Eventually, Rajesh made a decision that surprised even himself. He announced to his family and business partners that he intended to undertake a journey with an empty cart, following no predetermined trade route and carrying no merchandise except basic supplies for survival. He could not adequately explain his motivation even to himself, knowing only that the sage's question had awakened a hunger for discovery that could not be satisfied through conventional trading. His colleagues and family members reacted with predictable concern, fearing that the stresses of business had affected his judgment. They pointed out the obvious waste of resources such a journey would represent, the opportunities that would be lost while he indulged in what appeared to be an elaborate form of recreation. Some wondered aloud whether he might be suffering from an ailment that affected his reasoning, since the decision seemed so contrary to everything that had made him successful. Rajesh listened to their concerns with understanding, but found that he could not be dissuaded from his chosen course. Something deeper than logic was calling him toward this experiment in emptiness, and he had learned to trust the intuitive wisdom that had guided him through many successful business decisions. He prepared his cart with the same careful attention he brought to commercial ventures, but instead of loading it with goods, he left it deliberately empty except for the most essential travel necessities. The first days of his journey brought an unexpected sense of liberation that surprised him with its intensity. Without the weight of valuable cargo requiring constant vigilance, he found that he could pay attention to aspects of travel that had been invisible to him during his commercial expeditions. The changing quality of light throughout the day, the subtle variations in terrain that told stories of geological history, the different sounds that marked the transition from one region to another. As he traveled with his empty cart along roads he had traversed countless times before, Rajesh began to discover that emptiness created space for experiences that fullness had crowded out. Without predetermined destinations dictated by market opportunities, he was free to follow paths that seemed interesting rather than profitable. Without the anxiety of protecting valuable merchandise, he could approach strangers with genuine curiosity rather than commercial calculation. In a small village where he had never stopped during his trading journeys, Rajesh encountered a community celebrating the completion of a temple that had taken decades to build. The villagers welcomed him to join their festivities with a generosity that seemed to flow naturally from their shared joy in accomplishment. He found himself participating in rituals and conversations that revealed perspectives on life and value that his business-focused travels had never allowed him to encounter. An elderly temple priest, noticing Rajesh's empty cart, engaged him in a conversation about the Buddhist teaching that emptiness is not the absence of something valuable, but rather the presence of infinite possibility. The priest explained that a cup's usefulness lies not in the clay that forms its walls, but in the empty space that allows it to hold water. Similarly, a room's value exists not in its walls and roof, but in the empty space that provides shelter for human activity. This conversation opened new dimensions of understanding for the traveling merchant. He began to recognize that his empty cart was not lacking in value, but was instead rich with potential for discoveries that a loaded cart could never accommodate. The physical emptiness created space for experiences, relationships, and insights that the pressure of commercial success had systematically excluded from his previous journeys. Days turned into weeks as Rajesh continued his unconventional expedition, finding that each empty mile brought unexpected riches of experience and understanding. He encountered fellow travelers who shared stories and wisdom freely because they recognized in his unhurried pace and genuine attention the qualities of someone truly available for human connection. He discovered natural wonders that he had passed by countless times, while focused on reaching profitable destinations according to predetermined schedules. In a mountain village where his empty cart drew curious questions, Rajesh found himself invited to witness a ceremony marking the completion of a young monk's meditation retreat. The simplicity of the celebration, conducted without any material display, but rich in meaning and community connection, provided a powerful contrast to the elaborate commercial transactions that had previously defined his understanding of significant events. The young monk, upon learning of Rajesh's experiment with traveling empty, shared a teaching story about a master who sent 2 students to fetch water from a distant well. The first student carried a large ornate bucket that impressed everyone who saw it, but proved too heavy and cumbersome to carry when filled. The second student brought a simple, lightweight container that drew no admiration, but efficiently served its intended purpose. The master used this experience to teach about the difference between apparent value and functional wisdom. As Rajesh continued his journey, he began to notice how the empty cart changed not only his external experiences, but also his internal state of mind. Without the constant mental inventory of goods and their values that normally occupied his thoughts, he found space for reflection and observation that had been absent during his commercial travels. His mind, like his cart, had been emptied of its usual cargo, creating room for new forms of awareness to emerge. He discovered that he was capable of forms of attention and appreciation that his busy commercial life had never allowed time to develop. The play of shadows cast by moving clouds, the intricate patterns of erosion that revealed geological history in roadside cliffs, the subtle variations in birdsong that marked territorial boundaries invisible to human eyes, all became sources of interest and wonder that enriched his journey in ways that no valuable cargo could have provided. In a desert oasis, where he paused to rest and resupply, Rajesh met a caravan master who had spent 40 years organizing trade expeditions across the most challenging routes of the known world. This experienced traveler, upon learning of the empty cart experiment, shared his observation that the most memorable and transformative moments of his long career had occurred not when his caravans were loaded with their most valuable merchandise, but during the quiet intervals between transactions when his attention was free to engage fully with the immediate experience of travel itself. The caravan master spoke of sunrises witnessed from mountain passes that no amount of gold could purchase, of conversations with fellow travelers that had changed his understanding of life's purpose, of moments of perfect solitude in vast landscapes that had taught him lessons about his place in the larger order of existence. These treasures, he explained, could only be gathered when one's cart, whether literal or metaphorical, contained enough emptiness to make room for experiences that transcended commercial value. As his unconventional journey neared its planned conclusion, Rajesh realized that his empty cart had become full in ways that his previous trading expeditions had never achieved. It was loaded with memories of genuine human connections, insights about the relationship between material and spiritual wealth, and a transformed understanding of what constituted a successful journey. These treasures were invisible to external observation, but more valuable than any merchandise he had ever transported. The return to his home city provided an opportunity to reflect on what he had discovered through his experiment with emptiness. His business partners and family members, initially concerned about the commercial waste his journey represented, gradually recognized that he had returned with something precious that no conventional trading expedition could have provided. His eyes held a depth that spoke of discoveries beyond the realm of profit and loss, and his presence carried a quality of peace that enriched every interaction. Rajesh found that his experience with the empty cart had fundamentally changed his approach to both business and life. While he returned to his commercial activities with renewed energy, he now understood that success required balancing the accumulation of material wealth with the cultivation of experiences and relationships that could only flourish in the spaciousness that intentional emptiness provided. He began incorporating regular periods of emptiness into his schedule, times when his attention was deliberately freed from commercial calculations to engage with the deeper currents of meaning and connection that flow through human existence. The story of the merchant and the empty cart spread through the trading communities of the region, carried by travelers who had encountered Rajesh during his transformative journey. Some merchants dismissed the tale as an eccentric indulgence that successful businessmen could afford, but practical traders could not emulate. Others found themselves intrigued by the suggestion that emptiness might contain forms of value that fullness invariably excluded from consideration. A few adventurous traders began experimenting with their own versions of empty journeys, discovering that the apparent waste of resources often yielded returns that could not be calculated in conventional terms. They found that periods of intentional emptiness enhanced their sensitivity to market opportunities, deepened their understanding of the human needs that commerce ultimately serves, and provided the mental clarity necessary for making wise decisions in an increasingly complex business environment. Years later, when young merchants sought Rajesh's advice on building successful careers, he would often share the story of his empty cart journey and the sage who had first suggested the experiment. He would explain that true prosperity required learning to value both fullness and emptiness, recognizing that each served essential functions in creating a life of genuine richness and satisfaction. As this sixth story settles into the quiet chambers of your consciousness, consider what empty carts you might be avoiding in your own life. Reflect on whether your days are so filled with activities and obligations that no space remains for the unexpected discoveries that only emptiness can accommodate. Like Rajesh's transformed understanding of value, you may find that the experiences you consider wasteful or unproductive actually provide access to treasures that your busy, productive moments systematically exclude. Notice how the fear of emptiness might be preventing you from encountering the fullness that paradoxically emerges when you create space for experiences that serve no predetermined purpose. The empty cart's value lay not in what it carried, but in what it made possible through its very emptiness. Similarly, the empty spaces in your schedule, the unproductive pauses in your day, and the moments when you accomplish nothing measurable might be precisely when life offers its most precious gifts. Rest now in the understanding that emptiness and fullness are not opposites, but complementary aspects of a complete existence. Like the merchant who learned to appreciate both loaded and empty carts, you can discover the wisdom of embracing both productivity and purposeless wandering, both achievement and simple being, both the accumulation of treasures and the spaciousness that allows their true value to be recognized and appreciated. Recognized and appreciated. Our seventh story carries us to the edge of a great kingdom where the boundaries between the civilized world and untamed wilderness blurred like watercolors in the rain. Here lived a woodcutter named Kai, whose daily work brought him deep into ancient forests where few humans dared to venture. This is the tale of the woodcutter and the singing tree, a story that reveals how the most profound teachings often come from sources we might otherwise overlook or destroy. Kai had inherited his profession from his father and grandfather before him, learning the craft of selecting and harvesting timber with the careful precision that comes from generations of accumulated wisdom. His knowledge of the forest was encyclopedic, encompassing not only which trees provided the finest wood for different purposes, but also the intricate relationships between soil, weather, and growth that determined the quality of each individual specimen. The woodcutter's reputation extended throughout the surrounding villages, where craftsmen and builders sought him out specifically for his ability to provide exactly the right timber for their needs. Kai possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify trees whose grain patterns would serve particular purposes, whose seasoning characteristics would meet specific requirements, and whose harvesting would cause minimal disruption to the forest ecosystem that sustained them all. Despite his expertise and the steady income it provided, Kai found his work increasingly burdensome as the years accumulated. The constant evaluation of living trees for their commercial potential had begun to feel like a form of spiritual taxation, reducing the forest's magnificent complexity to simple calculations of board feet and market value. He noticed that he no longer saw individual trees as living entities, but as potential lumber, their worth measured only by their utility to human purposes. One morning, while searching for oak suitable for a shipbuilder's specific requirements, Kai penetrated deeper into the forest than his usual routes demanded. The trees in this remote area grew with a wild magnificence that spoke of centuries undisturbed by human intervention. Their trunks rose like cathedral columns supporting a canopy so dense that the forest floor remained perpetually dim, carpeted with the accumulated wisdom of countless seasons. As he moved through this primal landscape, Kai's practiced eye automatically catalogued the commercial potential of the ancient trees surrounding him. Many specimens represented fortunes in high-quality timber, their perfect grain and massive size making them ideal for the most demanding construction projects. Yet something about the profound silence and untouched beauty of the place made him hesitate to mark any tree for future harvest. It was in this hesitation that Kai first became aware of a sound so subtle he initially mistook it for the whisper of wind through leaves. As he stood perfectly still, straining his senses to identify the source, he realized he was hearing something unprecedented in his decades of forest experience. One of the ancient trees was singing. The melody was unlike anything in his experience of natural sounds. It contained neither the random patterns of wind-stirred branches, nor the rhythmic repetition of insect songs, but rather a complex harmony that seemed to incorporate and transcend all the forest's various voices. The song rose and fell with a musical intelligence that suggested consciousness rather than mere acoustic accident. Following the sound with the tracking skills his profession had honed, Kai discovered its source in a massive pine that towered above its neighbours like a natural cathedral spire. The tree's trunk was so large that 10 men holding hands could not have encircled it, and its crown disappeared into the forest canopy at heights that made accurate estimation impossible. Yet it was not the tree's impressive size that held Kai transfixed, but the undeniable fact that beautiful music was emerging from its ancient form. The woodcutter approached the singing tree with a reverence he had not felt since childhood, when the forest had still seemed filled with mysteries beyond human comprehension. As he drew closer, the music became more distinct, revealing layers of melody that seemed to tell stories spanning centuries. He could hear in the tree's song the rhythm of seasons cycling through countless years, the patient growth that had lifted its crown toward distant light, the quiet wisdom that comes from witnessing the endless dance of forest life. Kai found himself sitting at the base of the singing tree, his professional agenda forgotten in the presence of something that transcended all his categories of understanding. Hours passed unnoticed as he listened to music that seemed to emanate not just from the tree itself, but from the entire forest ecosystem of which it formed the ancient heart. The song spoke of connections invisible to human perception, of relationships between soil and sky, root and leaf, that created the living symphony of the woodland community. As the day waned and practical concerns began to reassert themselves, Kai faced a dilemma that challenged everything he thought he knew about his work and its purpose. His professional training immediately recognized that this singing tree represented the finest timber specimen he had ever encountered. Its size, age, and obvious health made it extraordinarily valuable for commercial purposes, worth more than several years of his normal income. Yet the tree's song had awakened something in Kai's consciousness that made the thought of harvesting it feel like a form of sacrilege. He understood, with a certainty that bypassed rational analysis, that this ancient being served purposes far more important than providing lumber for human construction projects. Its song was a teaching that could only be offered by a consciousness that had spent centuries learning the deepest secrets of forest wisdom. The woodcutter returned home that evening in a state of profound internal conflict. His family depended on his income, and his reputation rested on his ability to locate and harvest the finest timber available. The singing tree represented an opportunity that might never come again, a specimen so perfect that its sale could secure his family's future for years to come. Yet he found himself unable to mark it for cutting, knowing that its destruction would silence a voice that spoke truths beyond the reach of human commerce. Days passed as Kai wrestled with his decision, returning repeatedly to the singing tree in hopes of finding some resolution to his dilemma. Each visit deepened his appreciation for the tree's unique gift, while simultaneously increasing his awareness of the financial sacrifice his restraint represented. He began to understand that the tree was offering him a teaching about the relationship between material and spiritual values that could only be learned through direct experience of such profound conflict. During one of these visits, as he sat in his customary position at the base of the singing tree, Kai encountered another presence in the ancient grove. An elderly monk had somehow found his way to this remote location, drawn perhaps by the same mysterious music that had captivated the woodcutter's attention. The monk's weathered face reflected years of contemplative practice, and his eyes held the depth that comes from long acquaintance with life's deeper mysteries. The two men acknowledged each other with the respectful silence appropriate to such a sacred space, then settled into shared contemplation of the tree's extraordinary gift. The monk's presence seemed to create permission for Kai to speak about his internal struggle, and he found himself confessing the conflict between his professional obligations and his growing conviction that some things transcended commercial value. The monk listened with the patient attention that characterizes those who have learned to hear not just words, but the deeper meanings they attempt to express. When Kai had finished describing his dilemma, the monk shared a teaching story about a master craftsman who had been commissioned to create a musical instrument of unprecedented beauty and power. The craftsman had searched throughout the known world for wood with exactly the right acoustic properties, finally discovering a tree whose unique characteristics made it perfect for his purpose. Yet as the craftsman prepared to harvest this perfect specimen, he realized that the tree was already creating music more beautiful than any instrument he could fashion from its wood. He understood that his role was not to transform the tree into something else, but to recognize and protect its existing perfection. The craftsman became the tree's guardian rather than its destroyer, ensuring that its natural music could continue to enrich the world for generations to come. The monk's story illuminated Kai's situation in ways that dissolved his internal conflict, without eliminating the real costs his decision would entail. He understood that his encounter with the singing tree was offering him an opportunity to expand his understanding of his profession's true purpose. Perhaps a woodcutter's highest calling was not always to harvest timber, but sometimes to recognize and preserve sources of value that transcended commercial measurement. From that day forward, Kai's approach to his work underwent a fundamental transformation. While he continued to provide timber for legitimate construction needs, he developed a new sensitivity to the unique qualities that made certain trees more valuable as living beings than as commercial lumber. He began to see his role not just as a harvester of resources, but as a curator of the forest's diverse gifts to the world. Word of the singing tree gradually spread through the network of travelers, monks, and seekers who seemed to possess mysterious knowledge of such sacred places. Visitors began making pilgrimages to experience the tree's music for themselves, each finding in its song exactly what their particular spiritual needs required. Some heard teachings about patience and endurance, Others discovered insights into the interconnected nature of all existence. And many simply found in the tree's presence a quality of peace that transformed their understanding of life's deeper purposes. Kai became the unofficial guardian of this sacred grove, ensuring that visitors approached with appropriate reverence and that the tree's environment remained undisturbed by human intrusion. He found that his role as protector brought satisfactions that his previous focus on harvesting had never provided. The tree's continued singing became a source of joy that enriched not only his own life, but the lives of countless others who benefited from its preserved wisdom. The woodcutter's choice to preserve, rather than harvest the singing tree, became a teaching story that spread far beyond the forest where it occurred. Parents shared it with children struggling to understand the difference between price and value. Teachers used it to illustrate the importance of recognizing gifts that transcend material measurement, and spiritual seekers found in it a perfect example of how apparent sacrifice often leads to rewards that could never be purchased. Years later, when young apprentices came to learn the woodcutter's trade, Kai would often take them to visit the singing tree as part of their education. He would explain that true mastery of any craft required learning not only how to take from the natural world, but also when to refrain from taking, how to recognize value that transcended immediate utility, and why some gifts serve their highest purpose only when left completely undisturbed. The ancient pine continued its song through changing seasons and passing years, its music evolving with the forest's natural rhythms while maintaining the essential harmony that had first captured Kai's attention. Visitors would often remark that the tree's songs seemed to change according to their individual needs, offering exactly the teaching or comfort that their current life circumstances required. Whether this was a quality of the tree itself or a reflection of the listener's varying capacities for reception, remained one of the mysteries that enhanced rather than diminished the tree's sacred significance. As this seventh story finds its resting place within your consciousness, consider what singing trees you may have encountered in your own life. Sources of beauty, wisdom, or inspiration that offered their greatest gifts only when left undisturbed rather than harvested for immediate practical use. Reflect on whether your habitual approach to valuable discoveries is always to acquire or utilize them, or whether you sometimes recognize that certain treasures serve their highest purpose only when preserved in their natural state. Think about the relationship between material and spiritual wealth that Kai's story illuminates, and how the choice to protect rather than exploit can sometimes yield returns that surpass any commercial gain. The woodcutter's transformation from harvester to guardian represents a shift in understanding that you too might experience when you encounter something whose value transcends its utility to your immediate purposes. Rest now in the recognition that some of life's most precious gifts come not from what you take, but from what you choose to leave untouched, allowing their natural wisdom to continue flowing into the world in ways that benefit countless beings across generations. Like the singing tree's eternal music, the treasures you preserve rather than consume may offer their richest rewards to those who come after you, creating legacies of beauty and meaning that extend far beyond your individual lifetime. Our eighth tale draws us into the bustling heart of a great city where merchants and mystics, nobles and beggars, all moved through streets that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless dreams. Here we encounter the story of the baker and the sacred dough, a teaching about how the most ordinary work can become a pathway to extraordinary understanding when approached with the proper spirit of devotion and awareness. Amara had inherited her bakery from her mother, who had received it from her grandmother, continuing a lineage of bread makers that stretched back through generations of women who had fed their community with skill, dedication, and an almost mystical understanding of the alchemy that transforms simple ingredients into sustaining nourishment. The small shop occupied the ground floor of an ancient building, whose upper stories housed families that had become as familiar to Amara as her own relatives. Every morning before dawn, while the city still slept beneath its blanket of stars and dreams, Amara would begin the daily ritual that had shaped her entire adult life. She would kindle her ovens with the same careful attention her ancestors had brought to this sacred task, selecting wood that burned with the proper temperature and timing, creating the precise conditions that would transform raw dough into the bread that sustained her neighborhood's daily existence. The process of bread making had become as natural to Amara as breathing, her hands moving with the unconscious precision that comes from decades of repetitive practice. She could judge the exact moment when dough had achieved perfect consistency, could adjust her recipes according to subtle variations in flour and weather, and could time her baking so that fresh loaves emerged from her ovens exactly when her customers needed them most. Yet despite her undeniable mastery of the baker's art, Amara had begun to feel that something essential was missing from her work. The daily routine that had once filled her with satisfaction now seemed mechanical and repetitive, lacking the sense of deeper purpose that she remembered from her early years in the profession. She found herself going through the motions of bread making without the joy and engagement that had originally drawn her to follow in her family's footsteps. One morning, as she worked with a batch of dough that seemed particularly resistant to her usual techniques, Amara encountered an elderly customer who had been coming to her bakery for many years but had never engaged in anything more than the brief pleasantries that accompanied commercial transactions. This morning, however, the old woman lingered after purchasing her daily loaf, observing Amara's work with an attention that seemed to perceive layers of meaning invisible to casual observation. The woman commented on the care and precision that Amara brought to her craft, noting details of technique that revealed deep knowledge of the bread-making process. She spoke of bread not merely as food, but as a form of communion, a daily miracle that connected human effort with natural processes in ways that nourished both body and spirit. Her words carried the authority of one who had contemplated deeply the significance of ordinary activities that others took for granted. As their conversation continued, the elderly customer revealed that she had spent many years in contemplative practice, learning to recognize the sacred dimensions hidden within everyday activities. She explained that the most profound spiritual teachings were often found not in exotic practices or esoteric knowledge, but in the patient attention brought to simple, repetitive tasks that formed the foundation of human community life. The woman shared her observation that Amara's bread making contained all the elements of a complete spiritual practice: the patient preparation of ingredients, the careful attention to timing and temperature, the trust in natural processes that transformed separate elements into unified nourishment, and the generous offering of the final product to sustain others' daily existence. She suggested that Amara's sense of lost meaning might be restored by recognizing the inherent sacredness of work she had been performing all along. This conversation planted seeds of new understanding in Amara's consciousness that began to transform her relationship with her daily work. She started approaching each batch of dough not as routine production, but as an opportunity for meditation, bringing the same quality of presence to bread making that others might bring to formal spiritual practices. The familiar movements of kneading and shaping became gestures of devotion rather than mere mechanical repetition. As Amara's awareness deepened, she began to discover dimensions of bread making that her years of professional competence had somehow overlooked. She noticed how the dough responded differently to her touch depending on her internal state of mind, seeming to absorb and reflect the quality of attention she brought to the process. When she approached her work with impatience or distraction, the resulting bread lacked the subtle qualities that emerged when she maintained complete presence with each stage of preparation. The transformation in Amara's approach to her craft began to manifest in ways that her customers could taste and feel. Her bread developed a quality that went beyond mere technical excellence, carrying a sense of nourishment that seemed to satisfy hungers deeper than simple physical appetite. Regular customers began commenting on the enhanced flavor and texture of her loaves, though they could not identify exactly what had changed in her baking process. Word of the exceptional quality of Amara's bread began to spread throughout the city, attracting customers from neighborhoods far from her small bakery. Many came initially drawn by reports of superior taste and texture, but found themselves returning for reasons they could not fully articulate. There was something about bread from Amara's ovens that seemed to carry a quality of blessing, as if each loaf had been infused with an intention that transcended mere commercial food production. Among these new customers was a monk from a nearby monastery who had been sent to investigate reports of bread that seemed to possess unusual properties. Brother Marcus approached Amara's bakery with the skepticism of one trained to distinguish between genuine spiritual phenomena and mere wishful thinking, expecting to find nothing more than skillful marketing of ordinary commercial products. However, his first taste of Amara's bread revealed qualities that his years of contemplative practice had taught him to recognize. The bread carried a subtle energy that seemed to quiet his mind and open his heart in ways that reminded him of the most profound moments of his meditation practice. He realized that he was encountering not just exceptional baking technique, but bread that had been transformed by the spiritual presence that Amara brought to her work. Brother Marcus began visiting the bakery regularly, not only to purchase bread for his monastery, but to observe Amara's process and understand how ordinary bread making had become a vehicle for extraordinary spiritual expression. He watched as she approached each batch of dough with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar, her movements flowing with the natural rhythm of someone completely absorbed in sacred work. The monk recognized in Amara's transformed approach to baking the same quality of mindful devotion that characterized the most advanced spiritual practitioners he had known. She had discovered how to make every aspect of her work into a form of meditation, transforming routine commercial activity into a continuous prayer that blessed not only her own consciousness, but everyone who consumed the fruits of her labor. As their friendship deepened, Brother Marcus shared with Amara teachings from his monastic tradition about the sacred nature of work performed with complete attention and selfless intention. He explained that the monastery's own bread was prepared according to principles similar to those that Amara had intuitively discovered, with each stage of the process approached as an opportunity for spiritual development rather than mere practical necessity. The monk described how ancient masters had taught that any activity, no matter how humble or repetitive, could become a pathway to enlightenment when performed with the proper understanding and devotion. The key was not in the external nature of the work, but in the internal quality of presence and intention that the worker brought to each moment of activity. This validation of her intuitive discoveries encouraged Amara to deepen her exploration of bread making as spiritual practice. She began to understand that her daily work was not separate from any spiritual path she might choose to follow, but was itself a complete form of practice that engaged every aspect of her being in service to something greater than personal satisfaction or commercial success. The baker started incorporating periods of formal meditation into her daily routine, finding that these practices enhanced her sensitivity to the subtle aspects of bread making, while the bread making process itself became a form of moving meditation that complemented her sitting practice. The boundaries between work and worship dissolved as she discovered the seamless integration that characterizes authentic spiritual living. As Amara's reputation spread beyond her immediate neighborhood, visitors began coming to her bakery not only to purchase bread, but to observe and learn from her example of how ordinary work could be transformed into extraordinary service. Some were professional bakers seeking to improve their own craft. Others were spiritual seekers looking for practical ways to integrate contemplative awareness into daily life. Each visitor found in Amara's approach something relevant to their own circumstances and aspirations. The professional bakers discovered that bringing meditative attention to their work improved not only the quality of their products, but their own satisfaction and sense of purpose. The spiritual seekers learned that the path of awakening need not require abandoning worldly responsibilities, but could be found through bringing sacred awareness to whatever work life had placed before them. Amara began sharing her discoveries more formally, offering workshops where she taught both the technical aspects of bread making and the contemplative approaches that had transformed her experience of the craft. These gatherings became communities of practice, where participants learned not only how to bake exceptional bread, but how to approach any repetitive work as an opportunity for spiritual development. The workshops attracted people from diverse backgrounds and professions who recognized the universal applicability of Amara's teachings. Office workers learned to bring the same quality of presence to data entry that Amara brought to kneading dough. Parents discovered how routine household tasks could become opportunities for cultivating patience and mindfulness. Artists found that approaching their creative work with Amara's devotional attitude enhanced both their technical skills and their capacity for authentic expression. Years passed, and Amara's small bakery became a pilgrimage destination for those seeking to understand how the most ordinary activities could become vehicles for extraordinary transformation. The bread she produced continued to carry the subtle qualities that marked it as the product of sacred labor, nourishing not only her customers' bodies, but their spirits as well. The story of the baker and the sacred dough spread far beyond the city where it originated, carried by travelers who had experienced firsthand the power of bread made with complete presence and devotional intention. The tale became a teaching story used by spiritual teachers of various traditions to illustrate how enlightenment could be found not through escape from worldly responsibilities, but through their complete embrace with awakened awareness. Parents shared Amara's story with children who complained about boring chores, helping them understand that no task need be meaningless when approached with proper attention and care. Teachers used her example to demonstrate how excellence in any field could be achieved through the cultivation of mindful presence rather than merely technical skill. As this eighth story settles into the quiet depths of your consciousness, consider what ordinary tasks in your own life might be transformed through the same quality of presence and devotion that Amara brought to bread making. Reflect on whether you approach your daily work as mere obligation or whether you recognize it as potential spiritual practice, waiting to be awakened through your conscious attention. Notice how the baker's transformation occurred not through abandoning her worldly responsibilities, but through discovering their sacred dimensions. The same dough that had once seemed like routine commercial material became a vehicle for profound spiritual expression when approached with proper understanding and intention. Think about the repetitive activities that fill your days, perhaps cooking, cleaning, commuting, or any of the countless tasks that maintain the basic structure of human existence. Consider how these activities might become opportunities for meditation and devotion when approached with the same reverence that Amara learned to bring to her ancient craft. Rest now in the understanding that no work is too humble to serve as a pathway to awakening when performed with complete presence and selfless intention. Like the sacred dough that transformed under Amara's mindful touch, your own daily activities carry the potential to become vehicles for extraordinary growth and service when approached with the proper spirit of devotional awareness. Our ninth story emerges from the windswept highlands where shepherds guided their flocks across meadows that bloomed with wildflowers in spring and lay buried beneath snow through the long winter months. This is the tale of the shepherd boy and the echo, a teaching about the profound relationship between what we send out into the world and what returns to us, and how understanding this connection can transform our experience of both solitude and community. Young Kiran had been tending sheep in the high pastures since he could barely walk, following a tradition that connected him to generations of his family who had lived in harmony with the rhythms of mountain life. His days were spent in the vast solitude of rolling hills, where the only sounds were the bleating of his flock, the whisper of wind through grass, and the distant cry of eagles soaring on invisible currents far above the meadows. The work of shepherding required patience and vigilance, watching for dangers that might threaten the sheep, while ensuring they found the best grazing in pastures that changed with the seasons. Kiran had learned to read the subtle signs that warned of approaching weather, to identify the plants that nourished his animals and those that might harm them, and to move his flock along routes that avoided the precipices and ravines that scarred the mountain landscape. Despite his competence in the shepherd's craft, Kieran often struggled with feelings of loneliness that seemed to intensify with each passing season. The isolation that his work required had begun to feel like a burden rather than the peaceful solitude that previous generations of his family had cherished. He found himself longing for human conversation and companionship, yet his responsibilities kept him apart from the village community for months at a time. One afternoon, while his sheep grazed peacefully in a meadow surrounded by towering cliffs, Kieran began to experiment with the echoes that bounced off the rocky walls enclosing the valley. He called out simple words, delighting in hearing his own voice return to him with slight delays and altered tones that created the illusion of conversation with an invisible companion. At first, Kieran's experiments with echo were merely a form of entertainment, a way to break the silence that had become oppressive during the long hours of solitary watching. He would shout random words or phrases, laughing at the way the mountains seemed to answer him with voices that resembled his own, yet carried subtle differences created by the acoustic properties of stone and distance. As days passed, however, Kieran began to notice patterns in how his echoes responded that seemed to depend not only on the volume and clarity of his voice, but on something more subtle that he could not immediately identify. When he called out in anger or frustration, the returning echo seemed to carry those same harsh qualities amplified and intensified. When he spoke with gentleness or joy, the echo that returned seemed to enhance those positive qualities as well. This observation led Kieran to begin experimenting more deliberately with the emotional content of his calls to the mountains. He discovered that words, spoken with genuine warmth and kindness, returned to him in ways that felt like actual conversation with a benevolent friend. Harsh or bitter words, by contrast, came back to him with an edge that made him uncomfortable, as if the mountains were reflecting his own negativity back to him in ways that revealed its true character. The young shepherd began to understand that the echo was serving as a teacher, showing him with perfect honesty the quality of energy he was sending out into the world. The mountains acted like a mirror that could not lie or flatter, returning exactly what he offered, but allowing him to hear his own expressions from the perspective of a receiver rather than a sender. This realization transformed Kieran's relationship with both his solitude and his echo experiments. He began approaching his calls to the mountains as a form of practice, consciously choosing to speak with the same kindness and respect he would want to receive from others. The echo became his companion and teacher, helping him develop qualities of expression that he had never cultivated during his years of enforced silence. As his sensitivity to the echo's teachings deepened, Kieran started noticing how the same principles operated in his interactions with his sheep and the other creatures that shared the mountain environment. The energy he brought to his work as a shepherd seemed to influence how the animals responded to his presence and guidance. When he approached his flock with patience and gentle authority, they moved calmly and cooperatively. When frustration or impatience colored his actions, the sheep became nervous and difficult to manage. The shepherd boy began to recognize that the entire natural world was responding to his presence with the same honesty as the echo from the cliffs. The mountain environment was constantly reflecting back to him the quality of awareness and intention he brought to each moment, though he had been too preoccupied with his own concerns to notice these subtle forms of communication. One morning, while practicing his echo conversations with particular attention to maintaining a tone of genuine warmth and respect, Kieran was surprised to hear a response that seemed different from the usual patterns. Instead of his own voice returned with the familiar delay and acoustic modification, he heard what sounded like an entirely different voice answering his call across the valley. At first, Kieran thought his imagination was playing tricks on him, creating the illusion of companionship he had been craving. But as he called out again, carefully listening to the response, he became convinced that another person was indeed answering him from somewhere among the surrounding cliffs and meadows. The mysterious voice led to a series of calls and responses that eventually guided Kieran to discover another young shepherd who had been grazing his flock in a hidden valley just beyond the ridge that bordered Kieran's usual territory. This boy, named Tenzin, had been practicing his own form of echo communication for several seasons, developing the same sensitivity to the relationship between the energy sent out and the energy received that had become central to Kieran's recent discoveries. The meeting between the two shepherds created an immediate bond of understanding based on their shared exploration of how voice and intention could transform the experience of mountain solitude. They discovered that both had independently learned to use echo as a teacher, developing through their practice a sensitivity to the subtle qualities of expression that determined how their words were received and returned by the world around them. Tenzin shared with Kieran his own observations about how the principles revealed through echo work applied to all aspects of life in the mountains. He had noticed how his relationship with his sheep, with the weather, and even with his own internal states of mind seemed to follow the same pattern of reflection and return that characterized the acoustic properties of the valley walls. The two boys began meeting regularly in the meadow where their territories adjoined, sharing not only companionship, but insights about how their echo practices had changed their understanding of communication and relationship. They discovered that the same sensitivity they had developed for hearing the subtle qualities in returned sound applied to recognizing the often invisible ways that their attitudes and intentions influenced every interaction they encountered. Through their friendship, Kieran and Tenzin began to understand that loneliness was often not a result of physical isolation, but of failing to recognize the constant communication occurring between themselves and their environment. The mountains, the sheep, the weather, the plants, and even their own internal states were continuously responding to and reflecting the quality of presence they brought to each moment. Their echo practices evolved into a form of training for life in community as well as solitude. They learned to speak with the same consciousness of how their words would be received and returned that they had developed through their acoustic experiments. This awareness made them more sensitive listeners and more thoughtful speakers, qualities that served them well when they eventually returned to village life during the winter months. The other villagers noticed changes in both boys that went beyond the normal maturation expected from a season of independent responsibility in the mountains. Kieran and Tenzin carried themselves with a quality of attention and consideration that seemed to enhance every conversation they joined. Their presence seemed to encourage others to speak more thoughtfully and listen more carefully, creating ripples of improved communication throughout their community. Parents began asking the two young shepherds to share their experiences with children who struggled with conflicts or communication difficulties. The boys would explain their discovery that the energy they put into their words and actions was always reflected back to them, though sometimes the return took forms that were not immediately obvious. They taught younger children simple echo games that helped develop sensitivity to how tone and intention affected the way messages were received and returned. These games became popular throughout the mountain villages, with parents recognizing them as valuable tools for helping children understand the relationship between their own behavior and the responses they received from others. The echo teaching spread beyond childhood games to become a principle that adults found useful in their own relationships and community interactions. Farmers noticed how the energy they brought to their work with animals and crops seemed to influence the results they achieved. Merchants discovered that the respect and honesty they offered to customers was reflected in the loyalty and trust they received in return. Village elders incorporated the echo principle into their methods for resolving conflicts and disputes. They would help conflicting parties recognize how their own attitudes and approaches were being reflected in the responses they received from others, creating cycles that could be transformed through conscious changes in how they initiated each interaction. The story of the shepherd boys and their echo discoveries became a teaching tale that spread from village to village throughout the mountain region. Travelers carried the story to distant communities, where it was adapted to local conditions and circumstances, but always retained its core insight about the reflective nature of human communication and relationship. Teachers in monastery schools used the echo principle to help students understand how their attitudes toward learning and their relationships with instructors influenced the knowledge and wisdom they were able to receive. The concept provided a practical framework for understanding how spiritual development depended not only on receiving teachings, but on the quality of receptivity and respect that students brought to their practice. Artists and craftspeople found inspiration in the echo teaching for understanding how their internal states influenced their creative work. They learned to pay attention to the emotional and spiritual qualities they brought to their craft, recognizing how these inner conditions were reflected in the beauty and power of what they created. Years later, when Kiran and Tenzin had grown to become respected members of their community, they would often return to the mountain meadows where they had first discovered the echo's teachings. They would practice calling across the valleys, not only for the joy of hearing their voices returned by the ancient cliffs, but to maintain their sensitivity to the constant feedback that life provides about the energy and intention we bring to each moment. The meadow where they had first met became a place of pilgrimage for young people seeking to understand how their own attitudes and approaches shaped the responses they received from the world. Visitors would practice echo calling while reflecting on relationships or situations in their own lives where they might be receiving exactly the energy they were unconsciously sending out. The echo practice became a form of meditation that helped people recognize patterns in their interactions that they had previously attributed to external circumstances or other people's behavior. By learning to hear clearly what they were putting out into the world, practitioners could begin to consciously choose the quality of energy they wanted to contribute to each situation. As this ninth story finds its place in the quiet chambers of your heart, consider the echoes in your own life, the ways that your attitudes, words, and intentions are constantly being reflected back to you through the responses of others and the circumstances you encounter. Like Kiran's discovery in the mountain meadows, you may find that what seems like external opposition or support is often a faithful reflection of the energy you are unconsciously broadcasting. Reflect on relationships or situations where you have felt frustrated by the responses you receive from others. Consider whether these patterns might change if you approach them with the same conscious attention to your own tone and intention that the shepherd boys learned to bring to their echo practice. Notice how the quality of listening and speaking that you offer in conversations seems to influence the depth and authenticity of what others are willing to share with you. Like the honest mirror of the mountain cliffs, the people around you may be reflecting back exactly the level of presence and respect that you bring to your interactions with them. Rest now in the understanding that you are continuously participating in a vast conversation with life itself, where every attitude and intention you express creates echoes that return to you in countless ways. By learning to listen carefully to these returning echoes, you can become increasingly conscious of the energy you contribute to the world and increasingly skillful in creating the kinds of responses and relationships that serve everyone involved. Our 10th story carries us to the edge of a great desert, where a small oasis provided the only source of water for travelers crossing the vast expanse of sand and stone that stretched beyond every horizon. Here lived a waterkeeper named Fatima, whose family had served passing caravans for generations with the precious gift of life-sustaining refreshment. This is the tale of the waterkeeper and the bottomless well, a teaching about the paradox of abundance and scarcity, and how our relationship to resources determines whether we experience limitation or inexhaustible plenty. As these 10 sacred stories settle into the deepest chambers of your being, allow their wisdom to weave together like golden threads in the tapestry of your consciousness. Each tale you have heard tonight carries within it seeds of transformation that will continue to grow and blossom in the fertile silence of your rest, offering their gifts in moments when you most need their guidance. The merchant's singing bowl reminds you that true treasures often hide behind humble appearances, waiting for eyes of wisdom to recognize their worth. The cracked pot teaches that your perceived imperfections may be precisely what allows you to create unexpected gardens of beauty in the world. The monk's unconditional kindness reveals how grace can transform even the most desperate heart when met with fearless compassion. These ancient teachings speak across centuries to touch something timeless within you, that place of knowing that exists beyond the reach of doubt or confusion. As sleep embraces you, trust that the wisdom of countless generations flows through these stories into your dreams, where understanding blooms without effort and peace settles like gentle rain upon the landscape of your soul. Rest now in the profound silence that holds all stories, all wisdom, all beings in its infinite embrace. May you wake refreshed and renewed, carrying within your heart the luminous teachings that have been your companions through this sacred night.